Welcome to the night when the fields themselves seemed to breathe, when the sky over Louisiana flickered red and the scent of burning cotton rolled like thunder across the swamps. It was the night a woman whose name was never written down decided that silence was a kind of death. And so she chose fire. Before we begin, leave a comment where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening. Because tonight you'll hear her story not from the books that forgot her, but from the flames that refused to die. The plantation ledger called her property. The overseer called her trouble. But in the dark, amid rows of cotton heavy with dew, she was something else entirely, a storm waiting to be born. The sound began softly, a match striking the hiss of oil-soaked rags. Then came the blaze roaring, devouring, illuminating her face in flashes of defiance. It was said the fire spread faster than anyone had seen, as if the earth itself wanted to help her burn away her chains. That night in 1859, near the bayous of Point Coupé Parish, an entire field turned to flame. And by dawn, the overseer's house was ash. No one claimed the act, no one confessed. But whispers began to crawl through the quarters that a woman had lit. The match smiled and disappeared into the woods. Some said she walked across the river that night, carrying only a torch and a song that no one had heard before. And yet, there are other voices. The Freedmen's Bureau records decades later spoke of a woman of extraordinary will, one who vanished after the Great Fire of '59. No one could find her grave. No one could trace her name. But they remembered her by the glow that returned each harvest, faint orange shimmering between the stalks long after the war was done. Some say it was just gaslight rising from the swamp. Others swear it was her, the woman who fought back with fire, still walking, still watching. Louisiana, summer of 1859. The air hung thick with the sweetness of decay. It was a world of sugar cane and sorrow, where the sun bled into the river and the nights carried the sound of chains like distant thunder. On the plantation roads outside Point Coupé Parish, the land stretched endlessly. Fields of cotton shimmering under the heat, wooden cabins crouched low against the earth, their smoke curling upward like ghosts too tired to rise. The world was trembling then, not from storms or earthquakes, but from the slow, rumbling sound of change. Across the South, whispers were spreading news of uprisings of men and women who refused to kneel. Newspapers in New Orleans printed anxious words, restlessness among the colored population. Planters muttered in private, clutching their pistols tighter. Somewhere far to the north, voices like John Brown's were calling fire down upon the system itself. The whole country was a field of dry cotton waiting for a single spark. And in Louisiana, that spark was already smoldering. The plantation system here was not a simple chain. It was an empire. It ran on sugar, on blood, on the endless cycle of hands that picked and hauled and died without names. The air tasted of ash and molasses. The nights were filled with the hum of insects and the weary songs of the enslaved, sung not to the masters, but to something older, something that still listened when no one else did. Every plantation had its rhythm: dawn, work, whip, dusk, prayer, silence. Yet beneath that rhythm, another pulse beat quietly, one of defiance, of coded messages whispered between cabins of songs that meant more than their words. Wade in the water, they'd sing softly, the melody rising and falling like the river itself. God's gonna trouble the water. It sounded like a hymn, but it was a map, a warning, a promise. By 1859, Louisiana's plantations were growing nervous. There had been small fires, unexplained, accidental. Overseers wrote reports in trembling hands, trying to convince themselves the slaves were too afraid, too broken, too dependent to rebel. But history had already proven them wrong, from Nat Turner's uprising in Virginia to the revolts in the Caribbean. The fear of rebellion was the one fear the South never spoke aloud. And still, in the cabin something stirred. Imagine a night there, the heat pressing in the air, thick with the smell of sweat and wood smoke. Inside a one-room shanty, a woman sits by a dying fire. Her hands are scarred, her hair wrapped in a cloth, her eyes reflecting the flame's restless dance. Around her others sleep too tired, too afraid to dream. But she doesn't sleep. She watches the fire. She listens to the wind. She hears something it's saying, something she can't unhear. The overseer had beaten a boy that morning until his back opened like paper. He was 15. She'd seen the way the whips sang through the air, the way the others turned away, swallowing rage like poison. She'd cleaned his wounds in silence, her hands trembling not from fear, but from fury. By nightfall, something in her had broken, or maybe it had awoken. They called her Etta in the quarters, though that might not have been her name. The records don't show it, they rarely did. But an oral story gathered by the Works Progress Administration nearly 80 years later tells of a woman in Louisiana. She burned her master's field. Say she was tired of the sun beating her, and the whip following close behind. The interviewer had laughed when he read it aloud, called it folklore. But to those who told it, it was memory. Etta's world was small, a patch of earth, a bucket, a row of cotton, a shadow in the doorway. But her anger was wide as the river. And in Louisiana, the river carries everything. She wasn't the only one who felt it, the sense that something was coming. The old folks whispered of signs, candles that wouldn't stay lit, birds flying backward at dusk, dreams of fire and flood. The younger ones laughed, but when lightning struck a tree beside the cabins and set it ablaze, even the laughter died. Fire, they said, was both a curse and a cleansing. The planters thought of fire as punishment, a threat, a weapon to burn down what disobeyed. But for those in the quarters, fire was something else. It was freedom in its purest form. It could destroy the whip, the wall, the ledger, all the things that claimed ownership over them. Fire was God's language, they said, when prayers went unheard. And so, as the summer stretched on, the ground grew dry and brittle, perfect for what was coming. The overseer took pride in his discipline, writing in his diary that the Negroes are restless but manageable. He would not live to write again. Archival fragments tell us that on the evening of August 17, 1859, a fire broke out across 3 adjoining fields of the Landry plantation, spreading so fast that witnesses swore the flames had leapt the road. The New Orleans Bee newspaper reported it in 2 lines. Another mysterious blaze near Point Coupé, cause unknown. Several cabins lost. No mention of the people, only the loss of property. But the oral tales remembered more. They spoke of a woman standing at the edge of the blaze, torch in hand, watching her world burn, not in grief, but in triumph. She was gone by morning. And from that moment on, the legend grew past, quietly retold in whispers during harvest season. They called her the Woman of the Fire Road. Some said she crossed into the swamp and never came out. Others believed she joined a group of runaways deep in the Atchafalaya Basin, a hidden settlement where freedom was not a dream, but a secret reality. Years later, a missionary wrote in his journal about visiting a remote village in the wetlands, a place where people live, without masters, governed by no one but the river. He mentioned a matriarch, a woman scarred by burns, who led with a calm fury. Her name, he said, was Henrietta. Henrietta. 2 names, or perhaps one that changed as survival demanded. Louisiana, 1859. A land on the edge of war, where freedom was a word spoken only in songs and dreams. But that summer, one woman made the word visible in flame, in smoke, in the charred remains of a ledger that listed her as someone's possession. And though the newspapers buried the story, though the planters rebuilt and the ashes blew away, the memory stayed carried in the mouths of the women who sang while they worked their voices, rising through the cotton like sparks, because fire spreads. And sometimes all it takes is one woman to light the whole field. The story of 1859, if you search for it in the archives, is almost invisible. There are no names, no confessions, no official inquiry into the fire that swallowed 3 cotton fields and the overseer's quarters outside Point Coupé Parish. All that remains are fragments. Burned pages, whispers in letters, a few lines in the New Orleans Bee, and a single entry in a plantation ledger that stops abruptly mid-sentence, August 17th. Unexpected blaze fields beyond salvage, one missing woman presumed dead. The ink ends there, blotted, smeared, as if the hand that wrote it shook. To reconstruct what happened that night, historians turn to the Freedmen's Bureau records, created after the Civil War, a vast catalog of complaints, depositions, and testimonies from former slaves and planters trying to claim property or prove losses. In one such file dated 1867 appears an unusual note. Witness from Point Coupé recalls the fire of '59, speaks of a woman named Etta who disappeared the same night. Rumor says she was seen later near the Atchafalaya marshes. No surname, no photograph. Just that a name drifting through time like smoke. But that one mention sparked a quiet obsession among scholars of the Reconstruction South, because Louisiana's plantation fires weren't rare yet. This one had details that didn't fit the pattern. There was the wind, the way it shifted that night, driving the flames against the direction of the bayou. There were the animals found, freed from their pens. And there were the accounts decades later of songs sung by the enslaved that spoke of a woman who burned the white man's crown. The first credible investigation into the firewoman of Point Coupé came in 1937 under the Works Progress Administration's Slave Narrative Project. A field worker named Eleanor B. Tucker, a white writer from New Orleans, interviewed more than 50 elders across southern Louisiana. In a transcript labeled Interview Number 23, Old Rosa, age 96, she recorded this exchange. Q. Did you ever hear of a woman who burned a plantation? A yes, ma'am. They say she done it for her boy. They beat him till he ain't wake up. She set the field alight, say if the devil want a soul, let him take the whole land too. Rosa's words weren't meant as history, they were meant as survival memory. The kind passed down by those who couldn't write but refused to forget. Across the WPA collection, similar fragments appear scattered incomplete like coals, left glowing long after the fire's gone out. One from St. Landry Parish speaks of a woman named Start with E. She go in the swamp, they say the fire followed her footprints. Another from Baton Rouge claims, some say, she called the fire herself, say she speak to it like kin. At first glance, these sound like folklore, exaggerated mystical. But in the 19th century, folklore was the only archive the enslaved were allowed to keep. They had no journals, no newspapers, no memorials. What they had were stories layered with code and faith. Beneath their songs lay road maps, beneath their ghost tales lay records of resistance. And when we strip away the superstition, something solid remains, a record of intent. In 1859, fires across the South were often blamed on Negro carelessness or accident. But the Louisiana Advertiser privately reported an internal correspondence between planters fearing organized plots among the colored laborers. One letter preserved in the Louisiana State Museum dated September 1, 1859, reads, "Gentlemen, there are increasing signs of mischief among the Negro quarters." The incident at Landry's place was not random. Keep watch at the night bells, they communicate through song. The fear in that letter bleeds through its ink planters, suddenly aware that even the simplest hymn might carry revolt beneath its melody. By late 1859, the state militia had begun patrolling rural roads under curfew, detaining any black person found after sundown without a pass. And still, the fires continued. Smaller now haylofts, cane barns, sheds, each one blamed on carelessness, yet too deliberate to be coincidence. In one case, in West Feliciana Parish, local authorities found bundles of dry cane wrapped in cloth and soaked with oil, hidden near the edge of a field. The discovery never reached the press, but the record sits quietly in the parish archives, marked simply, "Prepared kindling." Suspected intention of sabotage. To many, these were crimes. But to those who lived under the whip, they were language. The fact layer of 1859 shows us a pattern: coordinated, silence, sudden disappearance, the refusal to confess. The South would not understand it then. But these were early sparks of something larger, the silent rehearsals for the collective defiance that would erupt during the war, just 2 years later. And within that mosaic of silence stands one shadow, the woman at the center. The evidence points to a person likely enslaved on the Landry plantation who vanished after the August fire. Landry's death certificate lists smoke inhalation, an uncommon phrase for plantation records. His widow in her insurance claim wrote bitterly, "Everything lost. The Nucky woman to blame, though none will name her." That single line, half hatred, half admission, is the closest the archives come to naming Etta's crime. But for every piece of paperwork drenched in contempt, there are the songs that refuse to die. Ethnomusicologists from Tulane University studying field recordings in the 1930s found a recurring refrain among Louisiana spirituals. She walked through the fire, not a hair burned down, Lord. She walked through the fire, and the world turned round. It was catalogued as Firewalker's song, origin unknown. But one recording from 1935 includes an elderly singer, identified only as Aunt Geneva, who pauses mid-verse and whispers to the interviewer, "That one's 'bout Etta. We don't say her name no more." That's the paradox of history in the Black South. The louder the flame, the quieter the record. Even the Freedmen's Bureau, with its vast bureaucracy, barely acknowledged acts of female resistance. Women like Etta were doubly erased by race, by gender, by the refusal of the world to believe them capable of rage. And yet in silence, they shaped the mythos of defiance that future generations would inherit. By 1865, when Union troops marched into Louisiana, they encountered more than freed people. They met a population that had already begun freeing itself long before the Emancipation Proclamation. Officers reported towns of runaways hidden deep in the swamps, fortified by sheer will. One lieutenant described them as an independent settlement, self-sustaining, guarded by women with rifles. Somewhere within that maze of bayous, there might have been her Etta Henrietta, whoever she had become. A Union field report from April 1864 mentions a colored woman guiding escaped slaves through the marshes by lantern light, singing a song of fire. It's tempting to believe, though, historians tread carefully, for folklore can seduce as much as it reveals. But the overlapping patterns, the song, the region, the legend suggest a continuity too precise to ignore. Fact becomes folklore. Folklore becomes record. Record becomes ghost. And in the South, ghosts never leave quietly. When WPA field workers interviewed former slaves in the late 1930s, they noticed a curious superstition around harvest time. Workers refused to light lamps in the fields after dark. They said the fire woman might come if you disrespected the soil. They said she was not angry anymore, only watching, making sure no one else wore chains in the moonlight. To outsiders, this was myth plantation folklore, a symbol of guilt or fear. But for those whose grandparents once labored under the same sun, it was remembrance disguised as warning. And if you drive through Point Coupe Parish today, there's a stretch of earth they still call the Black Road. The soil there is darker than the rest, not from flooding, not from decay, but from something older that once burned deep into its roots. Locals say, no matter how much it rains, the earth there never truly cools. And every few summers, when the heat turns heavy and the cicadas cry, someone swears they see a flicker of orange dancing low along the horizon, a shimmer that moves against the wind. They call it heat lightning. But the old ones, the ones who still sing the songs, they know better. They say it's her, still walking, still carrying her torch through history's smoke. Because the documents can be lost, the ledgers can be burned. But memory finds its own way to stay lit. Night in the quarters. The air hangs heavy, sweet, wet, and trembling with the weight of things left unsaid. Somewhere beyond the cabins, the frogs croak in the bayou, their song blending with the rhythmic creak of wood, the sigh of wind through cane. A single lantern burns low, its flame small but stubborn, throwing gold against rough walls scarred by years of smoke. Inside, a woman sits alone. Her name perhaps is Etta, or Henriette. Maybe she's already begun shedding one name for another. Her hands are raw, the skin cracked from work, the fingertips darkened by sap and blood. She's stitching a strip of cloth, humming under her breath. The song is older than this land, older than her own sorrow. It drifts in a language she doesn't remember learning. It isn't prayer. It's preparation. Outside the plantation sleeps, but not peacefully. The overseer's dogs shift restlessly, as if they too sense the current changing. The men in the cabins murmur through dreams, calling to mothers long gone to children, sold away to a freedom they can't yet name. This is the human heartbeat of rebellion, not speeches, not banners, just a quiet resolve, gathering like heat beneath the skin. Etta's world is built on small rituals. She wakes before the horn so she can wash her face in still water before the others stir the mud. She ties her scarf tight, a faded red cloth that once belonged to her mother, passed down from the coast. They say her mother came from a place where women could command the fire, a story Etta half believed as a child. She'd whisper it to herself when the nights got long. The women who knew the flame never feared the dark. Now as the flame dances on her face, she understands. Earlier that day, she had watched a boy 15 maybe whipped until he no longer made a sound. They said he'd dropped his sack of cotton, that he'd talked back. The overseer hadn't stopped until his own arm gave out. When they dragged the boy away, limp, Etta caught his eye just for a second and saw in it the same fire she'd been holding back for years. It wasn't hatred, it was knowing. Knowing that to live like this forever was no life at all. When night came, she walked to the edge of the field. The moon was thin, a silver hook barely catching the world. She stood barefoot in the dirt, felt the cool soil between her toes, the hum of the earth under her heels. She whispered her mother's words again, this time not as comfort, but as vow. Let the fire remember. Folklore says that enslaved people believed fire could speak, that it carried the words of the dead. It was why during burials they'd sometimes light small torches and let them burn down to ash, believing the flame guided the soul's path. Maybe Etta believed that too. Or maybe she just wanted to make the land feel what she had felt burning, breaking alive. She didn't plan it like an act of war. It wasn't strategy or revenge. It was something older instinct, elemental, born of exhaustion and faith twisted together. She'd seen too much suffering contained by silence. Fire, at least, was honest. Around her, the fields stretched endless, a white sea under a black sky. The cotton plants rustled like whispers, the wind carrying the smell of sap and dust. She carried a small jar of oil stolen weeks ago and a rag tucked into her waistband. When she struck the first match, it was almost gentle, a single hiss, a flicker against the dark. She watched it eat the cloth slowly at first, then hungrily. The light reached her face for the first time that night. She smiled. Not out of joy, but release. The flame touched the dry stems, a soft crackle, then a roar. Within minutes, the world was orange. The fire spread like a living thing, climbing, reaching, dancing. It moved faster than she expected, or maybe exactly as she'd hoped. The heat hit her face like a hand, but she didn't flinch. She stood there watching it consume the work of her tormentors, the wealth they had stolen from her hands. Someone shouted from the big house, a sharp cry followed by chaos. Bells rang, dogs barked. She turned once just to see, not to run. The overseer stumbled into the yard, shouting orders, his white shirt glowing like a ghost in the firelight. The flames caught the fence, then the barn. The night turned to day. Folklore says she laughed, a sound wild and strange, not from madness, but from something like truth. They say her laughter carried through the smoke, that it reached even those who were too afraid to move, and for the first time, they felt their fear burn away. When the others finally fled the cabins, they found her gone. Some said she ran toward the woods. Others said she walked straight into the fire and vanished. The next morning, the only thing left was the red scarf, half burned, lying in the ash. Years later, in the oral histories gathered by the WPA survivors, would tell it differently. Some swore she lived, that she escaped through the swamp, joining Maroons who lived free deep in the bayou. They said she became a healer, a matriarch, a spirit guide. Others said she died that night, but her soul stayed protecting those who came after. When the fields get too hot, one elder said, that's her walking. Fact or myth both speak the same truth, that even in bondage, she chose to act. And that choice, the act of resistance, however small, rippled outward. After the fire plantation owners tightened their grip, whippings doubled, patrols increased. But beneath that cruelty, something irreversible had begun. The enslaved had seen the system bleed, seen it flinch. And once they'd seen that fear could never rule them the same way again. There's a passage in a letter written by a Union soldier years later, recalling what he'd heard in the countryside. They speak of a woman who set the night alight. Said she gave them courage when courage was forbidden. Said she's the reason they sang louder come morning. That's what revolutions are made of. Not battles, but whispers that refuse to die. In the quiet aftermath, as ashes settled over the soil, the plantation smelled of char and salt. The overseer's house was gone. The cotton was gone. But the people remained bent silent, staring at the ruins. The owner raged, swore vengeance, promised to rebuild. But among the enslaved, no one spoke her name aloud. They didn't need to. The smoke had already carried it. For weeks they worked under new eyes. Soldiers, foremen, replacements. But every night when the sun went down, they'd hum that same tune, slow, low, deliberate. Walk through the fire. It wasn't about Etta anymore. It was about all of them, about what it meant to be more than the world allowed. Even years later, when freedom came on paper, many of them would still feel the heat of that night in their bones. They'd tell their children never to forget, not because of vengeance, but because memory itself was a resistance. In some versions of the story, they say Etta's spirit appeared once more, decades later, to a woman named Louise, her granddaughter perhaps, who was picking cotton on the same land. Louise claimed she felt a hand on her shoulder, warm, gentle. When she turned, no one was there, only the faint smell of smoke and the hush of cicadas in the tall grass. Whether real or imagined, it changed her life. Louise left the fields, moved north, became one of the first teachers in a freedmen's school. When asked why she left, she said, "Because someone lit a fire long before I was born, and I just followed the light." That is the legacy of a woman who refused to kneel. Not a monument, not a headline, but a spark passed hand to hand, name to name. The fire didn't die that night. It moved quietly into the hearts of those who came after. And somewhere in the dark of Louisiana's fields, when the air grows still and the crickets hush, there's a glow on the horizon that doesn't fade. It isn't lightning. It isn't storm. It's remembrance. It's her, still burning. History rarely remembers the women who fought in silence. And when it does, it buries them under labels: criminal, hysterical, slave servant, arsonist. The woman who set fire to a Louisiana plantation in 1859 never made the front page of any paper. She existed only as a line in a burned ledger, as rumor as song. Yet in the decades that followed, traces of her defiance kept surfacing like embers that refused to die, glowing quietly beneath layers of ash. If you step into the Louisiana State Archives today, tucked between pages of brittle newspapers and fading ink, you'll find a letter dated November 1859. It was written by a local parish sheriff addressed to the governor. "Sir, it has come to our attention that certain colored women have been heard speaking in secret gatherings, referencing the fire near the Landry estate as the Night of Freedom. It may be necessary to apply stricter discipline, as the idea of vengeance spreads quickly among the female servants." The idea of vengeance spreads quickly among the female servants. It is one of the few contemporary acknowledgments that enslaved women could resist, that they could inspire rebellion not through arms, but through memory. From this point forward, the records thicken with paranoia. Reports of unauthorized hymns, night dances, hidden charms. The words are white ink, trying to explain something they could never understand, how faith and fury intertwined in the hearts of women who had nothing left to lose. After the fire of 1859, insurance claims poured in from Pointe Coupée and St. Landry parishes. Nearly all of them contained the same phrase, origin unknown, possibly malicious. But some went further. One planter, Pierre Thibodeau, wrote in frustration, "It is the women who stir this unrest. They whisper to one another while they wash. They speak in riddles when they cook. The men fear the whip. The women fear nothing." It's an extraordinary sentence, one that reveals not just fear, but truth. Because across the South, the rebellion of enslaved women often began in kitchens, laundries, and nurseries. They poisoned food, sabotaged tools, hid runaways, spread messages. And sometimes they burned. Historians call it everyday resistance, the small persistent acts that chipped away at an empire built on human misery. But for those who lived it, it wasn't theory. It was survival. The Louisiana fire wasn't an isolated event. Archival records show a wave of similar incidents across 1858 to 1860. A sugar mill fire in Iberville Parish, a barn blaze in St. Mary, a warehouse destroyed in Baton Rouge. None were ever solved. But together, they paint a pattern in unspoken movement. In the oral testimonies recorded 70 years later, elders remembered them not as crimes, but as omens. The land itself was turning, one man said, like it was tired of feeding evil. Folklore became record became scripture. In 1863, when Union troops finally reached Louisiana, they were astonished to find entire pockets of enslaved people already operating like autonomous villages. Some had built barricades, some had armed themselves with makeshift rifles, but in others, it was the women who led. A sergeant in the 1st Louisiana Native Guard wrote in his diary, "The women here are fierce and silent. They do not bow. One with scars down her arm told me she set fire to her master's barn long before we came. That's how freedom smells," she said. That diary now sits in the National Archives, faded but legible. It doesn't give a name, but it gives a voice, the closest thing we have to Etta's own words. Folklore from Pointe Coupée claims that Etta, or someone like her, survived long enough to join a maroon settlement deep in the Atchafalaya Basin. There, in the dense cypress swamp communities of escaped slaves, natives and free Creoles lived hidden from the reach of the Confederacy. Union maps from the era mark the region simply as impassable terrain. But the oral histories call it sanctuary. An 1871 missionary letter describes a hidden village governed by a woman of uncommon authority. They call her Maman Flamme, the mother of fire. The author dismisses her as a heathen leader practicing African superstitions. But beneath his disdain lies evidence of a matriarch, a teacher, a survivor. Maman Flamme. Could she have been Etta? Or perhaps her legacy had already become larger than life, a name that no longer belonged to one woman, but to many. In the years after the Civil War, the Freedmen's Bureau began documenting stories of runaways who had fled before emancipation. One file lists a woman of mixed complexion, height, 5'4" scar upon left arm, said to have lived in the marsh since before the war. Her name Henriette, surname unknown. The officer adds, she refused all aid, said the world outside the swamp still burns. It's a small haunting line, as if she had already seen enough of the world to know that freedom on paper meant little without justice in the soil. By the 1880s, the land she once burned was sold, replanted, and renamed. A new family built their fortune there. The old quarters were torn down. The overseer's bell melted into scrap. But sometimes the new workers would wake to find small patches of scorched earth, circles of black in the middle of healthy rows. No one could explain them. The owners called them lightning strikes. The laborers called them Etta's footprints. In 1932, when the WPA began its massive effort to record the memories of those who had lived through slavery. Field workers came to Louisiana armed with notebooks and tape machines. Among the hundreds of testimonies gathered, only one included a direct mention of her. The interviewer, cautious, labeled it plantation ghost story. But the old man being interviewed, a descendant of those who'd worked the Landry fields, didn't flinch. "She weren't no ghost," he said. "She were a woman. They burned her story, so we made it into song. That's how history survives when no one writes it down. It becomes rhythm, and the rhythm lived on." During the Great Migration, as thousands of black families left the South for Chicago, Detroit, and New York, they carried the song with them. Blues singers in the 1920s adapted it, jazz bands turned its refrain into a call and response. One recording from 1929 by singer Bessie Mae Dupree includes the lyric, "My mama's mama lit that flame, Lord, she burned her chains away." The recording crackles with static, the hiss of vinyl blending with the hiss of fire. The story had traveled 1,000 miles, changed shape, but the soul remained the same. Even in the archives of the Harlem Renaissance, Etta's ghost flickers. In 1938, poet Arna Bontemps published a little-known piece titled "The Woman with the Fire in Her Hands." It ends with these lines: "She burned a field so her child could see the stars. And still they call her dangerous." He never cited a source. But among the scholars of black folklore, it's understood he was writing about her. The academic world would later label her story apocryphal, part myth, part memory. But to the descendants of Louisiana's enslaved people, she remains as real as the land itself. Every summer near the bayous of Pointe Coupée, an informal gathering still takes place. They call it La Nuit des Cendres, the Night of Ashes. They light small fires along the riverbank, sing the old songs, and tell the story of the woman who fought back with flame. No one claims her name. No one owns her story. She belongs to all of them. The fact layer tells us she may have lived. The folklore layer tells us she never died. Between them lies the truth that rebellion doesn't need a name to exist. Even modern scientists studying the soil of those old fields note traces of carbon deeper than expected evidence of combustion long before industrial farming. They mark it as anomaly. But for those who still live nearby, it's proof. Proof that something once burned there that refused to fade. Fire leaves no bones, but it leaves memory. And memory in the Deep South is its own kind of resistance. When you walk the fields today, the air feels different, dense, electric. You can hear the hum of cicadas, the whisper of the river, the faint rustle of cane. But if you listen closely, really listen, you can almost hear it beneath the surface. The crackle of a match, the breath of a woman who refused to kneel, the heartbeat of defiance turning into flame. The historians can argue over evidence. The records can crumble. The names can fade. But the land remembers. The soil itself is the archive now. And when dusk falls over Louisiana, when the horizon burns orange before the night swallows it whole, that's when her story breathes again in smoke, in song, in silence. Because some rebellions never end. They just keep burning slow, invisible, eternal. History doesn't end where the pages stop. It echoes. It seeps through the soil. It hums in the songs of those who survived, and it flickers in the spaces between fact and memory. To understand what her fire truly meant, we have to follow it across years, across generations, through the smoke of forgotten wars, and the silence that tried to bury her name. By 1861, just 2 years after that August blaze, the United States had collapsed into civil war. Louisiana became a battleground. Plantations turned to supply camps, fields stripped bare, and the enslaved, once bound to the soil, began to vanish into the swamps and roads following the rumor of Union lines. The Confederacy called them deserters. The Union called them contraband. But they were neither. They were fugitives from a false history walking out of bondage towards something that still had no name. In one soldier's diary found in the National Archives, a brief passage stands out. On the march near Atchafalaya, we came upon a fire burning bright as the sun. An old woman stood before it singing. She told us her people were free long before Lincoln said so. Her hands were scarred, her eyes like storm clouds. She gave us food and sent us on. The men called her the Fire Mother. The Fire Mother. Might have been her, or perhaps someone who had carried her story forward. But what mattered was that her defiance had become a legend alive, a living scripture in a land of ashes. The war ended in 1865, and with it came the illusion of freedom. A freedom signed into law, stamped on paper, yet shackled by prejudice and blood. The Freedmen's Bureau arrived in Pointe Coupee Parish, mapping the ruins of plantations and counting the displaced. Their reports are clinical numbers, losses, crop estimates. But hidden in the margins are smaller notes written by weary officers who'd seen too much to ignore what they couldn't categorize. Locals speak of fires lighting the fields at night, claim they are ghosts. The freedwomen say they are warnings. Warnings that the land itself had learned the language of rebellion. It's here in the years after emancipation that her story begins to shift from a tale of vengeance to one of haunting. The same act that had once terrified planters now became folklore among the freed. Mothers would tell their children, "Don't forget the fire, for it's what burned your name into freedom." And yet, history began to erase her again. The Reconstruction era brought chaos, new laws, new violence, new lies. White militias roamed the countryside, reclaiming through terror what the war had taken from them. Freedmen were lynched for claiming wages, women were beaten for refusing old duties. And through it all, the fire stories persisted, whispered as both warning and hope. A report from the Louisiana Freedmen's Bureau in 1868 mentions unexplained arson among the fields once owned by the Landry estate, several fires breaking out at once, though no source found. Locals blamed superstition. Freedmen said nothing. But that same year, a black preacher named Isaiah Ransom recorded in his diary, "We lit candles for her, the firewoman. We do not call her ghost. We call her teacher." That single line turns myth into message, rebellion into ritual. For decades, this quiet faith endured. In the early 20th century, long after the Civil War, had become a photograph in school books. Louisiana's black communities still held small ceremonies at harvest. Lighting torches, humming the firewalker's song, invoking her spirit not as vengeance, but as protection. Women especially kept her memory alive. They'd whisper her tale to daughters and granddaughters, not as fantasy, but as inheritance. You come from the woman who burned what held her. By the 1920s, her story had crossed into the cities. The descendants of the South carried her flame north, hidden in lullabies, folded into blues songs etched in rhythm and verse. In Harlem, she became a symbol not of destruction, but of creation through defiance. Writers and singers took her myth and reshaped it, each generation adding new smoke to her fire. Langston Hughes once wrote, "Fire is the oldest freedom. It takes what is broken and gives it light." He never said whose fire he meant. But those who knew Louisiana's ghosts could tell. Yet for all the poetry, the truth remained scattered fragments of fact, scattered like ash across time. In 1940, an anthropologist named Dr. Ruth C. Montgomery conducted fieldwork in Pointe Coupee Parish, seeking evidence of maroon settlements. In her notebook found decades later in the Tulane archives, she wrote of meeting an elderly woman named Clara Jean, who claimed to be a great-granddaughter of the firewoman. Clara led her deep into the marshlands to a clearing filled with blackened soil and charred stumps. "She say her people come here when the world went mad," Montgomery wrote. "They build huts. They live free. They light fires every summer so the ancestors can find the way back. She sing me a song. I cannot write the words. Too sacred." Dr. Montgomery's notes were never published. She died before completing her study. But her field tapes, long thought lost, were found in 1989 in a university basement. On one recording, a faint voice hums through the static, a woman singing in Creole, her tone wavering but resolute. Between verses she whispers, "Elle brûle encore, she still burns. She still burns." It's a phrase that historians, musicians, and artists have since reclaimed, appearing in murals, in protest chants, in the quiet verses of poets who understand that history is not a chain of dates, but a chain of breath. And yet, in the archive of Louisiana's Department of Justice, another kind of record exists, darker, colder. A file dated 1859, labeled Suspicious Negro Activities, Landry Parish. Inside, a witness statement describes a colored woman seen near the fields before the fire carrying a torch and a jar. The officer's handwriting trails off. Across the margin, someone else, perhaps a later clerk, has scrawled a single word in red pencil myth. That one word meant to dismiss becomes the clearest evidence of all. For every official who tried to reduce her to legend, there were generations who kept her alive precisely because she could not be contained by ink. This is the climax of her story, the place where fact and faith converge, because what she ignited in 1859 was more than a fire. It was the first flicker of a truth too dangerous to record, that freedom was never granted, it was taken. Her act, one match, one moment, echoes through the ages as the purest form of rebellion self-definition. Centuries later, in the 1960s, when civil rights marchers carried torches through southern streets, journalists called them symbols of hope. But to the elders watching from porches, they were something older. They saw Etta's torch again passed hand to hand, century to century. In 1964, during the Freedom Summer, an activist named Evelyn Landry, a descendant of the same parish, wrote in her diary, "My grandmother told me of a woman who burned for us. I think of her when I light candles at meetings. I think of her when I'm afraid. She taught us all that fear burns too. Fear burns too." That is the revelation, the bridge that ties 1859 to every act of courage that followed. Her fire was never just destruction. It was transformation. It consumed the old and cleared space for the new. And maybe that's why the story endures, not because it's perfect, but because it's unfinished. Walk the fields today, and you'll see her absence everywhere. No plaque, no statue, no grave. Only air and earth. But sometimes when the late light hits the soil just right, you can see a faint shimmer, rising heat that isn't heat flame, that isn't fire. The locals call it the shimmer. Scientists say it's methane. The elders smile and shake their heads. That's her, they say, still watching. The camera lingers there on the horizon, the hum of cicadas blurring into a low wind. The voiceover fades softer now, almost reverent. Some stories survive not by being remembered, but by refusing to die. Some rebellions don't need monuments, they only need witnesses. And somewhere in that Louisiana dusk, where smoke once swallowed the sky, a woman's breath still lingers in the heat. You can almost hear her voice in the wind, a whisper, a warning, a promise. Let the fire remember. The story doesn't end with the flames. It lingers in the soil and the blood. In the song still sung when the nights grow long and the river turns quiet. The rebellion she began was never written into textbooks, never carved into stone. It was passed through breath and heartbeat, from mother to daughter, from whisper to prayer, from the edge of one century to the next. If you walk the back roads of Pointe Coupee Parish today, there's nothing left of the old plantation. The cane fields are gone, replaced by stretches of farmland and rusted fences. But the ground is darker than the rest. Farmers still talk about it, though, not in public. They say their machines sputter when they cross that patch. They say the soil hums, as if something beneath still moves. One of them, an old man with skin like weathered wood, told a journalist in 1978, "There's a place out here that don't forget. You can burn it, you can flood it, you can plant right over it. But it remembers. It remembers fire." The reporter wrote it off as folklore local color. But the locals know better. Because in the South, memory isn't history, it's haunting. Generations later, her story continues to change shape, shifting with each retelling. In the 1940s, she was a ghost who walked through smoke. In the 1960s, she was a freedom fighter before freedom had a name. In the 1980s, she was reimagined in poems, in murals, in jazz. A woman framed by flame, her face lit with defiance. And now in the quiet archives of Black history museums, her name appears again in fragments, in letters, in recordings of elders who refused to let her fade. A curator once said, "She exists somewhere between the truth and the dream." But isn't that where freedom always begins? Because freedom, real freedom, has always been born in contradiction. In the spaces where a woman could be both invisible and immortal, where her silence could burn louder than any cannon. The records say she disappeared in 1859. But the descendants say she never left. They say she watches every act of resistance, every protest, every march. Every time someone stands when told to kneel. She's there not as a saint, but as a reminder that liberation is not gentle. It devours what enslaves. And maybe that's why her fire frightens people still. For over a century, Louisiana's history books skipped the year 1859 entirely. They leapt from harvest yields to the Civil War, as if nothing of consequence had happened in between. But if you read the silences closely, the missing months, the smudged ledgers, the burned pages, you can see her there. In every blank space, in every absence that resists explanation. History is not what survives, it's what refuses to disappear. In 2003, an excavation team digging near the old Bayou Road uncovered the remains of what might have been a small settlement. Clay pots, burnt wood fragments of iron cookware. Carbon dating placed it in the late 1850s. They found traces of animal bone tools, a child's carved whistle. But the most striking object was a shard of glass melted and warped, fused to a layer of charcoal. The lead archaeologist described it as evidence of combustion. But for the locals who came to watch the dig, it meant something else. "That's hers," one woman said. "She left a piece so we wouldn't forget." No plaque marks the site. The fragment sits in a small university archive, labeled simply, "Unidentified Louisiana 19th Century Fire Layer." But to those who know the story, that's enough. Because every rebellion leaves a trace, even if the world pretends not to see it. As the voiceover slows, the screen fades to the Louisiana dusk. The same horizon, where she once stood, the air heavy with mist, the fields stretching endless. A slow breeze moves through the reeds, carrying the faint smell of rain and wood smoke. The sound of distant thunder rolls, or maybe it's something else, something older. You can almost hear the hum beneath the wind. A woman's voice, low, steady, unbroken. "Let the fire remember." It's both a prayer and a warning. A message for anyone who has ever been told to stay silent, to endure, to forget. Because memory, like flame, demands oxygen. And across the centuries, her fire has never run out of air. It burns in classrooms where children learn the names their ancestors were denied. It burns in protests where voices rise louder than fear. It burns in quiet moments when a mother tells her daughter, "You come from a line that doesn't bow." Somewhere between the fact and the myth, between the record and the song, she waits not as a ghost, but as a mirror. When we look at her story, we're forced to ask ourselves, if the world tried to erase her and failed, what else have we forgotten, and what would it mean? If we remembered. Before we fade to black, the narration pauses that breath between ending and echo. You've just heard the story of the woman who fought back with fire, a rebellion too fierce for history to hold. But her story isn't just about the past. It's about now. Because as long as there are voices still silenced, fields still burning, and truths still buried, her fire will keep walking among us. The music swells soft, mournful, alive. The screen fills with the glow of twilight, that impossible moment when day and night hold each other for just a second before letting go. Her silhouette stands against the horizon, torch in hand, face unreadable wind stirring her scarf. She turns. She walks into the dark. The screen fades to black. And in that silence, the final words appear slow, white, unwavering. Let the fire remember.